His maid kept stealing food from a mafia boss's kitchen. Not money, not valuables, just food. He followed her home that night, ready for answers. What he found on the other side of that door was something 20 years of power had never prepared him for. The thing about power is that it makes you notice everything. Every shift in a room, every glance that lasts a second too long, every door that closes just a little too quietly. Adrian Cole had built his empire on that kind of attention, the sharp, cold kind that most men never develop because they never have to. In his world, missing details didn't just cost money, they cost lives. So when food started disappearing from his kitchen, he noticed. Not money, not jewelry, not the bottle of 1962 Petrus sitting in his wine cellar that was worth more than most people's cars. Food. A block of aged cheese, half a roasted chicken wrapped in foil, a handful of bread rolls tucked inside a linen napkin. Small things, careful things. Things taken by someone who was hungry, but also someone who was afraid. Adrian stood at the kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning, staring at the empty shelf where his personal stock was kept. His chef, Marco, had already reported the missing items twice that week. Marco was a nervous man who sweated through his collar just standing near Adrian, so when he'd knocked on the office door that morning, he looked like a man walking toward a firing squad. "Mr. Cole, I don't want to cause trouble, but the food—" "I know," Adrian had said, without looking up from his desk. He had already pulled the security footage the night before. There were 14 cameras inside the mansion. Adrian had reviewed each one with the same calm, methodical focus he used when planning operations, rewinding, pausing, zooming. Most of the staff moves through the house in predictable patterns. The groundskeeper, always near the east garden before noon, the driver, smoking behind the garage at 10, the cook's assistant, sneaking extra sugar into his coffee when Marco wasn't looking. And then there was Mira Hayes. She appeared on camera at 6:47 in the evening, after the dinner service was done, when the kitchen was mostly empty. She moved quietly, like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. No sudden movements. She wrapped the food in cloth, not plastic, so it wouldn't make noise. She tucked it into the bottom of her bag beneath her folded uniform jacket. Then she straightened up, smoothed her apron, and walked out like nothing had happened. Adrian watched the footage 3 times. He wasn't angry. That surprised him. He kept waiting for the familiar, cold feeling, the one that usually came when someone in his circle decided to take what wasn't theirs. The feeling that said, "Handle it." But it didn't come. What came instead was something closer to curiosity. Because there was nothing in Mira Hayes that looked like greed. He'd seen greedy people his entire life. They had a certain look, a shiftiness around the eyes, a slight smirk they couldn't fully control, a quickness to their movements, like they were always ready to run. Mira didn't look like any of that. She looked tired. She looked like someone carrying a weight she'd never asked for, moving through her days and the last bit of fuel she had left. She'd worked in the mansion for 4 months, quiet, efficient, never complained, never made eye contact for too long. She was the kind of employee that blended into the background so completely that Adrian, who tracked people for a living, had barely registered her as an individual. Until now. He could have simply fired her. One call to his house manager and it would be done. Mira Hayes escorted out, her final check mailed to whatever address was on file, and that would be the end of it. That was the logical move, the clean move, the one that sent a clear message to the rest of the staff. But something stopped him. Why food? It was the question that kept surfacing. In a house full of things worth stealing, cash in the safe, electronics in every room, silverware old enough to be antique, she had chosen food. Specifically, she had chosen food that was already cooked, ready to eat, portable. Someone needed to eat tonight. That thought settled in Adrian's chest in a way he didn't fully understand, and he wasn't a man who liked things he didn't understand. He made a decision. He wouldn't confront her. Not yet. He wanted to know the full picture first. And in his experience, following someone home told you more about them in 1 hour than any interrogation ever could. People were different when they thought no one was watching. That's when the truth showed up. At 8:15 that evening, he watched from the window of his study as Mira walked down the long driveway toward the gate, her bag over her shoulder, her steps quick against the cold Chicago wind. She pulled her jacket tighter and didn't look back. Adrian set down his glass of bourbon. He grabbed his coat from the hook near the door, not the tailored one he wore to meetings, but an old dark one that didn't stand out. He told his driver to stay. He told his security detail he was taking a walk. They exchanged glances but said nothing, because men who worked for Adrian Cole had learned not to ask questions that weren't invited. He stepped out into the night, alone. Above him, the Chicago sky was the color of ash, and the wind carried the smell of rain that hadn't arrived yet. The city hummed in the distance. Sirens, traffic, the low roar of a world that never fully slept. Adrian turned up his collar and walked. He kept Mira in sight, but stayed far enough back that she wouldn't notice. She walked fast, head down, like a woman who had somewhere to be and no time to waste. She didn't stop to look in windows. She didn't check her phone. She just moved. And Adrian followed, not knowing that the next hour was going to change something inside him that he'd long since assumed was dead. She walked like someone who had done this 1,000 times. No hesitation at crossroads, no pausing to check directions. Mira Hayes moved through the city with the quiet certainty of a woman who knew exactly where she was going, and exactly how long she had to get there. Adrian stayed a full half-block behind, hands in his coat pockets, watching. The first thing he noticed was how quickly her world changed. Within 10 minutes of leaving his neighborhood, the wide, tree-lined streets gave way to narrower roads. The large, lit houses with iron gates and trimmed hedges disappeared, replaced by older buildings, some with boards over their windows, some with front steps that had crumbled at the edges and never been repaired. Streetlights appeared less frequently here, and the ones that existed flickered with the uncertain energy of things barely holding on. Adrian had grown up in a city like this. Not this part, but one like it. And he'd spent the last 20 years making sure he never had to return to anything that reminded him of it. Walking these streets now felt strange. Not frightening, just distant, like stepping back into a photograph of someone else's life. Mira didn't seem to notice any of it. This was her route. This was her normal. She reached a bus stop on the corner of Michigan and 43rd and stood beneath the cracked plastic shelter, her arms folded against the cold. Adrian stopped near a closed convenience store 20 meters back and leaned against the wall, watching without watching, the way you learn to do when surveillance becomes instinct. The bus arrived 7 minutes late. Mira got on without checking her phone, without impatience, without any expression at all. Adrian waited until the last possible second and boarded through the rear doors, dropping into a seat near the back. He pulled the collar of his coat up slightly and looked out the window. Mira sat 4 rows ahead, her bag on her lap, her eyes straight forward. The bus was half full, a tired-looking man in work boots, 2 teenagers sharing earphones, an older woman with grocery bags balanced on both knees. Ordinary people at the end of ordinary days. Adrian was the only person on that bus who didn't belong there, and he knew it. They rode for 20 minutes before Mira stood and pressed the stop button. She got off at a corner Adrian didn't recognize, somewhere on the south side, deep enough that the downtown skyline was only a faint glow behind the rooftops. The neighborhood here was quieter than the last, but not peacefully so. It was the kind of quiet that came from people staying inside. A few corner stores still had their lights on. A dog barked somewhere down an alley and then went silent. A group of young men stood near a parked car on the opposite side of the street, talking low. Mira walked past them without slowing down. One of the men glanced at her. She didn't look back. Adrian followed, staying in the shadows where he could. She turned down a side street, then another. The houses here were old, two-story structures that had once been decent working-class homes, but had been losing the fight against time for years. Peeling paint, sagging gutters, yards that had given up on grass and settled for dirt and weeds. Some had plastic chairs on their porches, some had nothing at all. Then Mira stopped. She paused in front of a house near the end of the block and did something Adrian hadn't seen her do the entire walk. She took a breath, a slow, deliberate one, like someone preparing themselves before stepping into a room, like whatever waited behind that door required a kind of strength she had to consciously gather. Then she reached into her bag, past the folded uniform, past the cloth-wrapped food, and pulled out a key. Adrian moved carefully to the side of the house, staying low, stepping over a rusted bicycle frame that lay forgotten against the fence. There was a window on the ground floor, its glass old and slightly warped, with a thin crack running from the top left corner almost to the center. A faint light glowed inside, warm and orange, the kind that came from a lamp with a low bulb, not overhead lighting. He looked through the cracked glass and stopped breathing. The room was small. A worn sofa with a blanket draped over one arm, a low table with a half-finished puzzle on it, crayon drawings taped to the wall, lopsided houses, stick figures, a yellow sun with too many rays, a single lamp in the corner casting everything in that warm amber light. And then the door opened, and 3 children came running. They moved the way children do when someone they've been waiting for finally arrives, all at once, without coordination, colliding into Mira before she'd even fully stepped inside. The youngest was a girl, maybe 5 or 6, with her hair in 2 uneven pigtails that had clearly been done without a mirror. She wrapped both arms around Mira's waist and pressed her face in without saying anything at all. The middle child was a boy, perhaps 8, who grabbed Mira's bag strap and immediately started asking something. Adrian couldn't hear the exact words through the glass, but the energy was clear. "Did you bring food? What did you bring?" The particular urgency of a child who has learned not to take meals for granted. And then there was the third child. He stood slightly apart from the other 2, older, maybe 9 or 10, with a stillness about him that seemed unusual for his age. He waited while the younger ones rushed forward, and when Mira finally looked up from the chaos of small arms and questions, their eyes met. Something passed between them, a look that carried more than words. The kind of look shared between 2 people who have been surviving together for long enough that they no longer need to explain anything to each other. The boy stepped forward and took the bag from her hands, gently, carefully, like he already knew what was in it and understood exactly what it had cost her to bring it home. Mira pulled all 3 of them close at once, her eyes closed, one hand on the girl's head, one arm around the older boy's shoulder. She held them the way people hold things they are terrified of losing, too tightly, but trying not to show it. Adrian stood motionless at the window. He had broken men twice his size without flinching. He had sat across from federal agents without blinking. He had made decisions in dark rooms that he would never speak aloud, and he had lived with every one of them without losing a single night's sleep. But watching that woman hold those children in that small, dim, barely furnished room, after 2 buses, a long, cold walk, and a day of silent labor in a house that didn't belong to her, something shifted in him, something quiet and unexpected, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed. He didn't move from that window for a long time. The wind pushed cold air against his back. The city hummed on in the distance. And Adrian Cole, feared, untouchable, powerful Adrian Cole, stood in the dark outside a crumbling house and felt, for the first time in a very long while, like the smallest person in the room. He should have left. That was the rational thing to do. He had seen enough, more than enough. He knew why the food was disappearing, and he knew now that Mira Hayes was not a thief in any way that actually mattered. He could walk back to the main road, call his driver, and return to the mansion with a full picture of the situation. Clean, efficient, done. But Adrian didn't move. There was something about the oldest boy that kept him at that window, something he couldn't name yet, a familiarity that sat just outside his reach, like a word on the tip of your tongue that refuses to arrive. He watched the boy move around the small room with quiet purpose, unpacking Mira's bag onto the kitchen counter, separating the food with careful hands. The younger two had dissolved back into their own world. The girl had returned to the sofa with a stuffed rabbit, and the middle boy was already eating a bread roll, talking with his mouth full about something that made Mira laugh despite herself. But the oldest one didn't eat yet. He portioned out the food first, 3 plates, then a 4th, smaller one, which he set aside separately, Adrian assumed for Mira herself. Only after everything was divided did the boy sit down and take anything for himself. 9, maybe 10 years old, and already carrying the instincts of someone twice his age. Adrian studied his face. The boy was lean in the way underfed children are lean, not the wiry leanness of an athletic kid, but something more fragile beneath the surface, like a structure under strain. His hair was dark and slightly overgrown, falling across his forehead. His jaw, even at that young age, had a sharpness to it, and his eyes, even from this distance, even through warped glass, were a particular shade of gray-green that caught the lamplight in a way that made Adrian's chest tighten without warning. He had seen those eyes before. The thought arrived so quietly that it took a moment to fully register. Adrian blinked, looked again. The boy had turned his head slightly, saying something to the younger girl, and the angle of his profile hit the lamplight in a new way. The straight line of his nose, the set of his brow, the slight downward pull at the corner of his mouth when he wasn't smiling. Adrian's hand pressed flat against the cold exterior wall of the house. No. The single word moved through him like cold water. He pulled back slightly from the window. Not out of caution now, but because his body had reacted before his mind caught up. A physical recoil, the kind that happens when something strikes a part of you that you had assumed was safely buried. Because he knew that face. Not exactly, not completely. It was blurred through the lens of childhood and years and a life lived in poverty. But the structure of it, the particular combination of features. He had seen that exact same profile in a photograph he hadn't looked at in over a decade. A photograph he hadn't thrown away, even though he had told himself he should, even though keeping it made no sense for a man like him. Her name had been Claire Reyes, 26 years old when he'd known her, a graduate student at Northwestern who'd wandered into the wrong bar on a Thursday night 11 years ago, and somehow ended up in a conversation with Adrian that lasted until 2 a.m. She had been the kind of woman who laughed at things that weren't quite jokes yet, who found the funny part a half-second before everyone else. Sharp, warm in a way that felt unfamiliar to him, real in a way that most people in his life were not. He had kept her separate from everything else. That was the rule he'd made for himself. She didn't come near his world, and his world didn't come near her. For almost a year, he had maintained that. Different phones, different cars, meetings in places no one who knew him would think to look. And then one night, a situation had escalated on the west side. A rival faction moving faster than expected, a threat that required his full and immediate attention. And in the chaos of those weeks, things had slipped. He had pulled back from her without fully explaining why. One conversation that ended badly, then silence that he kept telling himself was temporary. By the time he'd surfaced from that crisis 3 months later, Claire was gone. He'd looked, in his own way, not hard enough, he knew that now. At the time, he had convinced himself it was better this way, safer for her. A woman connected to him was a woman in danger, and the kindest thing he could do was let the distance become permanent. It was a clean story, a practical one. The kind of story that was easy to believe when you were the one telling it to yourself. But standing outside this crumbling house on the south side of Chicago, staring through cracked glass at a boy who had Claire's eyes and Claire's profile and Claire's particular way of holding his mouth when he was concentrating, the clean story fell apart completely. Adrian did the math without wanting to. Claire would have been 26 when they were together, 11 years ago. The boy looked 9, maybe 10. The timeline didn't just match. It lined up with the precision of something that had always been true, waiting patiently for him to stop running long enough to see it. The bread roll in the boy's hand. The careful way he'd portioned the food before touching any of it himself. The quiet maturity in a face that should still have had years of carelessness left in it. His son. The possibility landed in Adrian's chest, not like a dramatic revelation, but like something heavy being set down. The kind of weight you feel in your knees, in the base of your spine. Not loud, not cinematic, just real and enormous, and impossible to unfeel once it had arrived. Inside the room, Mira sat on the arm of the sofa and said something to the oldest boy. He looked up at her and gave a small, lopsided smile, and that smile was Claire's, too. So completely and undeniably that Adrian had to look away for a moment. He pressed his back against the wall of the house. Above him, the sky had finally started to release the rain it had been threatening all evening. Light at first, barely more than mist, landing cold against his face and the back of his hands. He didn't move. He stood there in the rain, outside a house he had no right to be near, feeling something he hadn't experienced in so long that it took him a moment to identify it. Guilt. Not the managed, logical kind he occasionally acknowledged in boardrooms and back offices, the kind you note, file away, and continue past. This was older and rawer than that. This was the kind that lives in the body. The kind that knows the difference between a mistake made in ignorance and a choice made in cowardice. He had left, not because it was safer for her. He could see that clearly now, in the cold and the dark and the rain, with those 3 underfed children on the other side of that glass. He had left because staying was complicated, and complicated things had always been easier for him to walk away from than to face. Claire had faced it alone, and then, apparently, she hadn't survived it at all. Adrian Cole, who had not cried since he was 11 years old, stood in the rain outside a stranger's window and felt the burn of something working its way up behind his eyes, something he refused to let arrive, but could not entirely push away. He straightened his collar. He stepped back from the window, and he walked back into the night carrying something he hadn't walked in with, a truth that could not be unknown, and a debt that no amount of money, power, or carefully maintained silence was ever going to settle. Adrian didn't sleep. That wasn't unusual for him. His nights had never been easy, even in the best years. But this was different. Most sleepless nights were spent running calculations, anticipating threats, mapping out moves 3 steps ahead. His mind was a machine that rarely went quiet, but at least it was usually pointed at something useful. Tonight, it was pointed at a boy's face. He sat in the leather chair behind his desk, with the lamp on low and a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched, and he stared at the far wall the way you stare at something that isn't there. The rain had picked up on the drive home and was now hitting the tall windows of his office in uneven waves. The rest of the mansion was completely silent. Everyone had long since gone to bed. Even the security rotation had settled into its quiet overnight rhythm. Adrian sat alone with a face he couldn't stop seeing and a name he hadn't said out loud in 11 years. Claire. By 5 in the morning he had made his decision. He didn't need more time with his feelings. Feelings, in his experience, only became manageable once you gave them facts to stand on. Emotion without information was just noise. So he would get the information. All of it. Clean, complete, and fast. At 7 sharp, he called Danny Cho. Danny was not officially employed by Adrian in any capacity that existed on paper. What he was, practically speaking, was the most capable and discreet information broker Adrian had ever worked with. a former intelligence analyst who had left government work under circumstances that were never fully explained and had spent the last decade doing quiet research for people who needed answers that couldn't be found through conventional means. He was also one of perhaps 4 people on Earth that Adrian trusted without reservation. "I need a full background on 2 people," Adrian said when Danny picked up. No greeting. Danny didn't expect one. Claire Reyes. She would have been in her mid to late 20s, roughly a decade ago. Northwestern University connection, Chicago area. And her sister. "I need whatever you can find." A brief pause on the other end. "Timeline?" "Today." Another pause. "That's tight." "I know." "It'll cost extra for the speed." "Danny." "Right," Danny said. "Today." Adrian hung up and stood at his office window, watching the rain move across the city in slow, gray sheets. Chicago in the morning after a night of rain looked washed and tired. The streets dark with water, the skyline muted, everything slightly dulled. He watched a single cab move along the road below and thought about a woman laughing in a bar 11 years ago, and how easy it had been, in the end, to let that laughter go quiet. The file arrived at 4:17 that afternoon. Danny delivered it in person, as he always did with sensitive material, a plain manila folder, no labels, handed over in Adrian's private office, with the door closed and no one else present. Danny sat across the desk with the careful stillness of a man who had learned to read rooms, and said nothing while Adrian opened it. The first page was Claire. Claire Maria Reyes, born April 3rd, graduated Northwestern with a degree in social work. Adrian hadn't known that. In the years after they'd known each other, she had taken a position with a nonprofit on the North Side, working with at-risk youth. The file included a small photograph, a staff photo from the nonprofit's website, dated about 8 years back. Adrian looked at it for a long time. She looked older than he remembered, but not in a hard way, in the way that people look when they've been doing something that matters and it has asked something real of them. Her smile in the photo was the same one he remembered, the one that arrived a half-second faster than everyone else's. He turned the page. Claire Reyes had died 6 years ago. Cervical cancer, diagnosed late. Too late, the medical summary suggested, in the way that late diagnoses often happen to people without adequate health care. She had passed within 14 months of diagnosis. She was 31 years old. Adrian set the page down. He didn't reach for his bourbon. He didn't move at all for a moment. He just sat with that fact. 31 years old, and let it be as heavy as it actually was, without trying to process it into something more manageable. 31. Younger than he'd been when they met. He turned to the next page. Claire had 3 children. The oldest, a boy named Lucas, was 10 years old. The middle child, a boy named Tomas, was 8. The youngest, a girl named Rosa, was 6. No father listed on any of the birth certificates, a detail that Adrian noted without surprise, and with a specific kind of shame that settled quietly into his chest and stayed there. Lucas. He filed the name away carefully. 10 years old, the one with Claire's eyes. The final section of the file covered Mira Elena Hayes, née Reyes, Claire's younger sister, now 28. She had been 22 when Claire was diagnosed and 23 when Claire died, which meant she had spent the better part of her adult life raising 3 children that weren't biologically hers, in a city that offered her no particular support for doing so. Her employment history told the story efficiently. A series of cleaning and domestic service positions, each one lasting between 4 and 10 months, each one located on the wealthier side of the city. Long commutes, low wages, no benefits. She had worked for 3 other households before Adrian's, a hotel before that, a restaurant before the hotel. She had never taken more than 2 days off work in a row in 5 years, because 2 days off in a row meant 2 days without income, and 2 days without income had consequences that Adrian was only now fully understanding. There were no records of financial assistance, no government support beyond minimal food stamps that had lapsed twice when her paperwork fell through the cracks of an overwhelmed system, no help from extended family. Both parents were deceased, and Claire had been the only sibling. No savings, no safety net of any kind. Just Mira, showing up every day to clean the houses of wealthy strangers, wearing a face that gave nothing away, carrying everything alone. Adrian closed the folder. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Danny, who had been sitting quietly across the desk the entire time, waited without speaking. That was what made him invaluable. "She's been doing this alone for 6 years," Adrian said finally. Not a question, just a fact he needed to say out loud to make it fully real. "Looks like it," Danny said. Adrian nodded slowly. "The boy. Lucas." He paused. "Pull whatever records exist around the time Claire and I were together. Dates, anything that helps establish a timeline." Danny didn't ask why. He simply nodded and made a note. "And Danny," Adrian's voice dropped slightly, taking on the particular quiet that the people closest to him had learned to pay close attention to. "This stays in this room. Nothing reaches the floor. Nothing reaches anyone on my team. No one." "Understood." After Danny left, Adrian sat alone in the office with the closed folder in front of him and the rain still pressing against the windows. The bourbon remained untouched. The room was very quiet. He thought about a 22-year-old girl, barely an adult herself, standing in a hospital corridor being told her sister wasn't going to make it, and understanding in that moment that 3 small children were about to become her entire world, whether she was ready or not. He thought about 6 years of double bus rides and cold walks and cloth-wrapped food tucked under a uniform jacket. He thought about Lucas, portioning out dinner before touching any of it himself, 10 years old and already built for survival. Adrian Cole had ordered men to do terrible things in dark rooms and slept soundly afterward. He had made calculations that involved human cost and accepted those costs without flinching. He had told himself, for most of his adult life, that guilt was a luxury that people in his position could not afford. Sitting alone in his office at 5 p.m, with Claire's face on a page in front of him and the sound of rain filling the silence, he couldn't afford anything else. Adrian chose the kitchen deliberately. Not his office, not the formal sitting room, not any of the spaces in the mansion that were designed to remind people of the distance between themselves and him. The kitchen was neutral in a way those rooms weren't. Practical, functional, stripped of the architecture of power. If he was going to have this conversation, he wanted it to happen somewhere that felt, as much as anything in his house could feel, like level ground. He told the house manager to clear the kitchen staff at 4 o'clock. No explanation. The house manager nodded and made it happen, because that was how things worked here. At 4:15, he asked for Mira Hayes. She came in, still holding her cleaning cloth. That detail lodged in Adrian's mind immediately. The cloth folded over her hand, slightly damp, the way it would be if she'd been pulled from a task mid-movement. She hadn't been given time to prepare herself, which had been intentional on his part. People who had time to prepare brought armor. He didn't want armor. He wanted the truth in whatever form it arrived. She stopped just inside the doorway when she saw him standing at the counter, not sitting, not positioned behind anything, just standing with his hands loose at his sides in the way he stood when he was trying, consciously, not to be threatening. Her face did something complicated in the space of about 1 second. He watched the sequence move through her, the flicker of fear, the tightening of the jaw that suppressed it, the careful neutrality that settled over everything afterward like a shade being drawn. She had a remarkable face for control. He recognized the skill because he had spent years developing the same one. "Mr. Cole." Her voice was steady. "Sit down, Mira." Something moved behind her eyes at the use of her first name. She didn't sit. She stayed where she was, just inside the doorway, with the unconscious positioning of someone who wanted to remain close to the exit. He noticed it and didn't comment on it. "I know about the food," he said. She absorbed this without visible reaction, which told him she had already anticipated this conversation and had been carrying the weight of its arrival for some time. "I understand," she said. "I'll get my things." "I didn't ask you to get your things." She paused. The cloth in her hand tightened slightly, the only visible sign of the tension underneath. "Then I don't understand what this is." "I followed you home," Adrian said, clean and direct because she deserved that much. 3 weeks ago, after I saw the footage, I needed to understand why, so I followed you." The shift in her expression was immediate and unguarded, the first genuinely unguarded thing he'd seen from her. Not fear this time, something hotter than fear. Her chin came up slightly. "You followed me?" "Yes." "To my home?" The words arrived carefully, each one placed with precision. "Where my children were." "I watched through the window. I didn't go inside. I didn't approach any of them." "That," Mira said, with a quiet that was considerably more dangerous than volume would have been, "is not the reassurance you think it is." He accepted that without defending himself. "You're right." She stared at him. The hot thing behind her eyes was building now, finding its footing. "So you've been in my home, without my knowledge, watching my family, and now you've called me in here. And I meant to do what, exactly? Thank you for not firing me?" "I know about the children," Adrian said. "All 3 of them. I know about Claire." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Mira went completely motionless. The cloth in her hand went slack. For a moment, the careful control she'd maintained since walking through the door simply ceased. Not collapsed dramatically, just ceased, the way a held breath ceases when the body finally insists on air. Then it came back, harder than before, and she straightened in the doorway with the particular posture of someone who has decided that if they are going to be standing in this moment, they will stand in it fully. "How much do you know?" Her voice had changed, still controlled, but differently now, loaded. "Enough," he said. "I ran a background check. I know Claire passed away 6 years ago. I know you took the children in. I know you've been doing it alone." He paused. "And I know that the oldest boy, Lucas, I know when he was born. I know the timeline." Mira looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed, a short, hard sound that carried no warmth whatsoever. "Of course you do. You find out in a background check. Not because you bothered to look 11 years ago, not because you stayed, because you ran a check." She shook her head. "Very thorough of you. Mira, she loved you." The words arrived without warning and hit the air between them like something physical. Mira's voice didn't shake, but the effort of keeping it from doing so was visible. "She actually loved you. And when she needed you, when she was alone and frightened and carrying your child, you had already decided that your life was too complicated for her, that she was too complicated for you." Adrian said nothing. "She never once spoke badly of you to me," Mira continued. "Not once. Even at the end, when talking was hard and she was exhausted and she had every reason in the world to be furious, she didn't. And I was furious enough for both of us, so I suppose it balanced out." The kitchen was very quiet. "I don't want your money," Mira said. "And I don't want your guilt, because guilt is just something you feel that costs you nothing and changes nothing. Those children do not need a criminal for a father. They've survived without you this long. Lucas is 10 years old and already more of a man than—" She stopped herself, pulled back from wherever that sentence had been going. Adrian let the silence sit for a moment. Then, "You've been taking food from my kitchen because you didn't have enough." "That's correct." "You've been working double shifts in houses on the other side of the city and riding 2 buses each way in the cold because the wages are better over here than anywhere else." "Also correct." And you've been doing all of it alone for 6 years. What's your point? My point, Adrian said quietly, is that you are one of the strongest people I have ever encountered. And I am asking you, not telling you, asking to let me help. Not for my sake, not to clean up my conscience, for Lucas, for Tomas, for Rosa. Something faltered in her face when he said their names, just briefly, just enough. You had your chance to be part of their lives, she said. It came and went 11 years ago. I know that. He held her gaze. I'm not asking for that chance back. I'm asking for a new one, a different one, whatever shape you decide it can take. Mira looked at him for a long, reading moment. The way she looked at things she hadn't yet decided how to handle, measuring them against everything she knew and everything she'd survived and everything she still had left to protect. Then she unfolded the cloth in her hand, set it on the counter between them, and walked out of the kitchen without another word. She didn't say yes, but she hadn't said no either. And Adrian, who had spent his entire life reading the difference between a closed door and one left barely ajar, understood exactly what she'd left behind her in that room. Not permission, not forgiveness, just the smallest possible amount of space. He would have to decide what to do with it. The mansion had eyes everywhere. That was by design. Adrian had built his household the same way he'd built his operation. Layered, watched, with information flowing upward to him at all times. Every staff member knew their role. Every role had boundaries, and anything that fell outside those boundaries got noticed, catalogued, and reported. It was a system that had protected him for years, which meant that when Adrian started behaving differently, the system noticed him too. It started with small things. The staff observed without appearing to. It was something people learned quickly in a house like this, the art of peripheral awareness. They noticed that Mr. Cole had stopped eating dinner at his desk, that he'd walked through the kitchen twice in 3 days at hours he'd never appeared there before, that he'd stood at the window overlooking the staff entrance on Tuesday evening for nearly 20 minutes, watching something in the driveway below. They noticed that his eyes, when they moved through a room, had started stopping at Mira Hayes. It was Reeves who put it together first. Vincent Reeves had been Adrian's right-hand man for 9 years. He was 41, compact, and built from the kind of quiet competence that never called attention to itself. Where Adrian was the force of the operation, the name, the presence, the authority that made rooms rearrange themselves, Reeves was the infrastructure underneath. He handled logistics, managed the inner circle, and spent most of his waking hours making sure that nothing in Adrian's world moved without his awareness. He had survived 9 years in that position by being very good at one specific thing: noticing when Adrian was distracted. Distraction, in their world, was not a personal failing. It was a tactical vulnerability, and Reeves treated it with the same seriousness he gave to rival threats and law enforcement movements, because in his experience, the dangers that came from inside a man's head were often more damaging than anything that came from outside. On Wednesday morning, he knocked on Adrian's office door and entered without waiting, one of the few people permitted to do so. "You didn't sign off on the Harwick transfer," Reeves said, setting a folder on the desk. Adrian glanced at it. "I'll do it this afternoon." "It was due yesterday." "Then it'll be a day late." Adrian's tone was even, unbothered. He turned back to whatever he'd been looking at on his laptop, but Reeves caught, in that brief moment, that the screen was not showing operational data. It was a property record, a residential address in the South Side. Reeves said nothing about what he'd seen. He simply nodded, picked up a copy of the folder, and left. But he didn't let it go. Over the next 2 days, Reeves moved carefully. He didn't ask questions openly. That wasn't his style, and it wasn't how things worked between them. Instead, he gathered. He cross-referenced the addresses he'd glimpsed on Adrian's screen. He reviewed the household staff files with a level of detail that went beyond administrative interest. And he pulled the security logs, Not camera footage, which required Adrian's direct authorization, but entry and exit timestamps, which fell within his own access level. Mira Hayes. Entry, 7:04 a.m. Exit, 8:22 p.m. He noted the exit time. Standard shift ended at 8. 22 minutes was not a meaningful discrepancy on its own, but combined with everything else, Adrian's kitchen appearances, the window watching, the South Side address on the screen, it formed a picture that Reeves didn't like. He didn't confront Adrian, not yet. He needed more before he brought anything forward, because bringing an incomplete concern to Adrian Cole was a faster way to lose his trust than saying nothing at all. So he went looking on his own. Across the city, in a different kind of office, smaller, dirtier, located above a dry-cleaning shop on the west side, a man named Sal Ferretti was also paying attention. Sal ran a mid-level operation that had been pressing against Adrian's territory for the better part of 2 years. Not a full rival. He wasn't powerful enough for that, and he was smart enough to know it. But he was opportunistic in the way that small predators are opportunistic. Patient, watchful, and very good at identifying the moment when something larger than him became briefly vulnerable. He had a man inside the outer ring of Adrian's social circle. Not inner circle, nothing that sensitive, but close enough to pick up the kind of gossip that floated around the edges of major operations. Bar conversations, parking lot exchanges, the loose talk that happened when people assumed they were speaking privately. The information that arrived this week was unusual. Adrian Cole had been seen, alone and on foot, in a South Side neighborhood that had no known connection to any of his operations. Twice. Possibly 3 times. He'd had no security with him on at least one occasion, which was either reckless or deliberate, but either way was extraordinary for a man of his profile. Sal leaned back in his chair and turned this information over slowly. Adrian Cole walking alone through the South Side wasn't a business move. Business moves had infrastructure, cars, personnel, preparation. This was personal, which meant it was emotional. And emotional, in Sal's experience, was another word for exploitable. He sent 2 of his men to the area to watch quietly. "Don't engage anything," he told them. "Don't approach anyone. Just watch and tell me what you see." He lit a cigarette and thought about leverage. Leverage was the true currency of their world. Not money, not muscle. The right piece of leverage at the right moment could accomplish what 100 armed men couldn't. And if Adrian Cole had something personal happening on the South Side, something he was trying to keep off the books, off his team's radar, that was very interesting indeed. Back at the mansion, Mira was finishing the East Corridor when she felt it. She couldn't have explained it precisely. It was more instinct than evidence. The faint sense of being watched, in a way that was different from the ordinary awareness of working in a house full of cameras. She'd grown accustomed to those. This was something else. A pair of eyes that followed her movement a half-second too long, then looked away. She straightened up from the windowsill she'd been cleaning and glanced down the corridor. Reeves was standing at the far end, a folder under his arm, appearing for all the world like a man simply passing through. But he wasn't moving, and his eyes, when they met hers, didn't carry the vacant indifference that most of the senior staff wore around household employees. They carried assessment. Mira held his gaze for exactly 1 second, long enough to show she wasn't rattled, short enough to show she wasn't challenging anything, then looked back down at her work. Her hands were steady, her face was neutral. 6 years of keeping yourself together in situations where falling apart was not an option had given her a particular kind of control that looked, from the outside, like calm. But inside, a quiet alarm was sounding. She didn't know what Reeves knew, or suspected, or was looking for. She didn't know about Sal Ferretti's men, who were at that moment parking a gray sedan 2 streets away from the house where her children slept. She didn't know that the conversation she'd had with Adrian 2 days ago, the one that had left her hands shaking and her jaw set and her heart hammering against her ribs, had already sent ripples far beyond the kitchen walls where it had taken place. She only knew what her instincts were telling her, and her instincts, sharpened by 6 years of surviving on the margins of other people's comfortable lives, were telling her that something had shifted, that the world around her children, the small, fragile world she had built from nothing and protected with everything she had, was no longer as invisible as she needed it to be. She wrung out the cleaning cloth over the bucket, folded it, moved to the next window, and quietly began to count the days until she could find a way out of this house before whatever was coming arrived at her door. Adrian gave the instructions on the Thursday morning, quietly and precisely, to a man named Ortega, who ran legitimate supply logistics for several of his front businesses and had never once asked a question that wasn't directly relevant to his assignment. Groceries. Good ones. Not luxury, nothing that stands out. Fresh vegetables, protein, bread, milk, whatever a household with 3 young children would need for 2 weeks. Medicine cabinet basics, children's fever medication, vitamins, bandages. And I want someone to look at the roof on the south side of the house. There's damage. Get it fixed quietly. No company branding on the vehicle, cash payment. Ortega wrote it all down without looking up. Name on the delivery? No name. Address? Adrian gave it. And if someone asks who sent it? Adrian was already looking back at the papers on his desk. They won't. The first delivery arrived on Friday afternoon, 2 large boxes left on the porch while Mira was still at the mansion finishing her shift. The roofer came Saturday morning, an older man who knocked, explained briefly that a neighborhood repair program had flagged the property, fixed the damaged section in under 3 hours, and left before Mira could press him for details that didn't exist. Adrian heard none of this directly. He didn't ask for confirmation or updates. He simply moved forward with his day. Meetings, calls, the ordinary machinery of running an empire, and told himself that what he'd done was practical, logical. A man in his position could afford to make a problem disappear. This was simply a different kind of problem. He almost believed it. Mira came home on Friday evening to find the boxes. She stood on the porch for a long moment, looking at them the way you look at something that doesn't fit the expected shape of your day. 2 boxes. No label, no return address, sealed with plain brown tape. She checked both sides, checked underneath, found nothing that explained them. She carried them inside without opening them yet, which was a particular kind of discipline, the kind that had kept her functional for 6 years. Don't react until you know what you're reacting to. Rosa immediately tried to open the closest one. Mira let her. When the flaps came apart and Rosa looked inside, she went very still in the way children go still when something exceeds their frame of reference. Then she looked up at Mira with enormous eyes and said, very seriously, "Tia, there's a chicken." "I see that." "A whole one." "Yes." "Can we eat it?" Tomas was already at the second box, pulling things out with increasing speed. Juice, apples, a bag of rice, canned tomatoes, 2 kinds of pasta, a jar of peanut butter, a box of cereal with a cartoon on the front that made him hold it up and show Mira like evidence of something miraculous. Mira stood in the middle of the small kitchen and looked at the food spreading across the counter and felt something complicated move through her. Gratitude and suspicion, arriving at exactly the same moment, tangled together so tightly she couldn't separate them. Lucas stood in the doorway. He was watching her, not the food. That was the difference between him and the younger 2. They were still young enough to let good things simply be good. Lucas had learned, the way children who have experienced uncertainty always learn, to look for what the good thing meant before deciding how to feel about it. "Who sent it?" he asked. "I don't know yet," Mira said. He nodded slowly, accepted that, then crossed the kitchen and began helping put things away with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, and didn't ask again. But Mira thought about it all weekend. She ran through every possibility, carefully and systematically, the way she approached problems she couldn't afford to get wrong. A neighbor? None of them had the means or the particular knowledge of what the family needed. A charity? She'd never registered with any organization. She'd tried, once, 2 years back, and the paperwork had stalled somewhere in a system that moved slower than her bills. Someone from the church 2 streets over occasionally left vegetables on the step, but nothing on this scale. By Sunday, when the roofer had come and gone and she'd stood in the yard looking up at the repaired section with the specific disorientation of someone whose problem has been solved without their permission, the list of possible explanations had narrowed down to one. She just couldn't make herself finish the thought. Lucas started asking about his father on a Sunday evening. It wasn't the first time. He'd circled the topic before, in the vague, testing way children approach things they sense are sensitive. But this time was different. This time, he sat across from Mira at the kitchen table after the younger 2 were in bed, and he asked with the directness of someone who has decided that circling is no longer enough. "Mom told you about him, right? Before she got sick?" Mira wrapped both hands around her mug. "Some things." "What kind of things?" "That he was complicated." She chose the word carefully. It was honest, without being a door she had to walk through entirely. Lucas considered this. "Complicated how?" "Complicated like someone who lived a certain kind of life that made other things difficult." She paused. "Your mother cared about him, I know that." "But he left." It wasn't a question. Mira didn't try to soften it. "Yes." Lucas looked at the table for a moment. His jaw had that particular set to it, the one that appeared when he was processing something he didn't fully have language for yet. Then he looked up. "Do you think he even knew about me?" The question hit Mira somewhere undefended, because the honest answer was, she didn't know. Claire had never told her. In those final months, when talking had become exhausting and time had become something they were both acutely aware of running short on, Claire had said only that she'd tried to reach him once after Lucas was born, and that nothing had come of it. Whether that meant he'd known and chosen silence, or never known at all, Mira had carried that uncertainty for 6 years without resolution. "I don't know," she said. Honest, clean, the only thing she had to offer. Lucas nodded like he'd expected that answer. Then he said quietly, "The food and the roof. That wasn't random, was it?" Mira looked at him carefully. 10 years old and already reading situations the way adults did, tracking patterns, drawing conclusions, arriving at places by logic that she hadn't finished walking toward herself. "I don't know," she said again, but this time they both understood that she did know, or strongly suspected, and that the knowing was something she hadn't yet decided what to do with. Lucas was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the gap in the fence and made its low, familiar sound, the one that had been there every night for the 6 years they'd lived in this house, so constant it had become a kind of white noise, a background to everything. "If it was him," Lucas said carefully, not looking at her, "does that mean he wants to fix it?" Mira thought about Adrian's face in the kitchen 2 days ago, the way he'd looked when she'd said the things she'd said, the fury she'd poured into that conversation, the years of anger that had finally had a face to direct themselves toward. He hadn't flinched, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't defended himself in any way that could be called adequate, because there was no adequate defense, and some part of him had clearly known that. And then anonymous groceries had appeared on her porch, and a roofer had arrived with a story that didn't hold together. "I think," Mira said slowly, "that he's trying to figure out how." Lucas absorbed this. Then he stood, pushed his chair in carefully, and paused at the doorway. "That's not the same as actually doing it," he said. Then he went to bed. Mira sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time after that, her hands around a mug that had gone cold, listening to the wind move through the fence and thinking about how a 10-year-old boy had just said, more precisely than she ever could have, exactly what was wrong with everything. It wasn't enough to want to fix something. You had to actually show up. The gray sedan had been parked on Mira's street for 2 days before she noticed it. That was the thing about living on the margins. You developed a specific sensitivity to things that were out of place, because out-of-place things in neighborhoods like hers rarely meant anything good. The sedan was too clean for the street. Its windows were tinted one shade darker than casual. It didn't belong to anyone she recognized, and in 6 years she had learned every car on this block the way sailors learn the particular shape of familiar coastlines. She noticed it on Monday evening, walking home from the bus stop. She didn't slow down, didn't look directly at it. She kept her pace even and her eyes forward, and filed it away with a cold efficiency she developed for threats she couldn't yet name. When she got inside, she locked both bolts, the original one that had been there when they moved in, and the second one she'd installed herself with a borrowed drill 18 months ago after a break-in 2 streets over. She didn't tell the children, but that night, after Rosa and Tomas were asleep, she sat on the edge of Lucas's bed and said, very quietly, "If I ever tell you to take your brother and sister to Mrs. Calloway's next door and stay there, I don't want any questions. I just want you to go. Immediately. You understand?" Lucas looked at her for a moment. "Is something happening?" "I don't know yet. Maybe nothing." She held his gaze. "But if I say go—" "We go," he said. She nodded, kissed his forehead, turned off his lamp. Tuesday arrived cold and overcast, with a sky the color of dirty concrete pressing low over the rooftops. Mira's shift at the mansion ran late. A guest had arrived unexpectedly, requiring additional room preparation, and by the time she reached her street, it was nearly 9:30 in the evening. The sedan was gone. She registered this before she registered anything else. The empty space where it had been sat wrongly in the landscape, the way a missing tooth sits wrongly in a familiar smile. Gone wasn't better. Gone meant something had changed, and change in situations like this rarely moved in a comfortable direction. She was 20 meters from her front door when she heard Rosa scream. The sound split the quiet of the street with a sharpness that bypassed every rational process in Mira's body and went straight to something older and more animal. She was running before the scream had fully ended. Her bag gone, her keys in her hand, her body moving on pure adrenaline through the dark toward the house. The front door was open. Not broken, opened. The lock on the door was a good one, she'd made sure of that, but a good lock and a determined person with the right tools were 2 different problems. She crossed the porch in 2 steps and came through the door and took in the scene in a single, shattering second. 2 men she didn't recognize were in the living room. One had Tomas by the arm and was pulling him toward the back door with the brisk, businesslike movement of someone executing a plan on a timeline. Tomas was crying but not struggling. He was frozen in the particular paralysis of a child confronted by something entirely outside his understanding of how the world works. Rosa was in the corner behind the sofa, which is where the scream had come from, and she was silent now, and pressed flat against the wall with her stuffed rabbit held in front of her like a shield. Lucas was standing between the second man and his siblings, just standing there, 10 years old, in his socks, with his arms slightly out at his sides. Not aggressive, not threatening, because he wasn't big enough or old enough for either of those things to mean anything. Just standing in the space between his family and the danger, the way someone stands in a doorway when they're the last line between inside and outside, and they know it. And they stand there anyway, because there is simply no other acceptable option. The sight of it stopped Mira's heart for 1 full beat. Then the back door came in. Not opened, came in. The entire frame, with a force and precision that spoke to someone who had done this before and understood exactly how much force a door of that age and construction could absorb before it stopped being a door. Both men turned toward the sound. Tomas, in the distraction, wrenched his arm free and scrambled toward Lucas, and Lucas grabbed him and pulled him back toward the corner where Rosa was. Adrian Cole walked through the broken door frame. He didn't say anything immediately. He took in the room in the same way Mira had, 1 quick, complete sweep, and then he looked at the two men with an expression so utterly flat and certain that the temperature of the room seemed to drop by several degrees. He was alone, but the way he occupied the space didn't suggest a man who felt the disadvantage of that. One of the men reached toward his jacket. "Don't," Adrian said. The word arrived with a quietness that was somehow more convincing than volume would have been. The man's hand stopped. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not the kind of thing that needed to be described in its details to be understood in its outcome. Adrian was not a man who had maintained his position for 20 years through reputation alone. When it was over, both men were restrained. Zip ties from Adrian's jacket pocket, applied with a practiced efficiency that spoke to preparation rather than improvisation. And Adrian was on the phone delivering 3 short sentences to someone on the other end, before hanging up without waiting for a response. Then the room went quiet. Rosa came out from behind the sofa slowly, still holding the rabbit. Tomas had buried his face against Lucas's shoulder and was breathing in the ragged, catching way that follows crying. Lucas was looking at Adrian over his brother's head with an expression that was not fear. It was something more complicated than fear, something that was trying to process too many things at once and had settled, for the moment, into a careful, watchful stillness. Adrian looked back at him, and something crossed his face that Mira had not seen there before. Not in the kitchen confrontation, not in any of the careful, controlled interactions they'd had in the mansion. It was unguarded in a way that powerful men almost never allowed themselves to be. Raw in the way that specific kind of pain is raw, the kind that arrives when you understand, completely and without available denial, exactly what you allowed to happen by not being present. He looked at Lucas the way a man looks at something he lost before he knew he had it. Mira stepped forward. "How did you know?" Her voice was steady, but only just. "I had someone watching the street." He said it without apology, without dressing it up. "When the sedan moved, I came." "You've been watching my house?" "I've been watching my son's house," he said quietly. The word son landed in the room like something physical. Rosa looked up at Mira. Tomas lifted his head from Lucas's shoulder, and Lucas, who had been so carefully still, let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep, as if he'd been holding it for much longer than tonight. Mira looked at Adrian for a long time. The anger was still there. It hadn't gone anywhere. It never fully would. But it existed now alongside something else. Something she hadn't expected to feel, and didn't entirely welcome because it complicated things that were easier when they were simple. He had come. Not with a phone call, not with money sent through an intermediary, not with anonymous boxes left on a porch. He had come himself, alone, through a broken door when it mattered. Lucas stepped forward, away from his siblings, toward Adrian. He stopped about 2 feet away and looked up at him with Claire's eyes, steady, direct, asking the question that his whole life had been quietly building toward. "Are you my dad?" The room held its breath. Adrian Cole, who had never flinched from anything, felt the back of his throat tighten in a way he couldn't control. He crouched down to the boy's level, which put them closer to equal, and he looked at Lucas the way you look at something you intend to be honest with, no matter what it costs you. "Yes," he said. Simple, undecorated, the only word available. Lucas studied him for a moment with the grave, measuring seriousness that had always made him seem older than his years. Then he said, "You weren't here before." "No," Adrian said. "I wasn't." "Why?" And Adrian, who always had an answer, who had built an entire life on never being caught without one, said the only true thing. "Because I was a coward." Lucas absorbed this. His expression shifted, not into forgiveness, not into warmth, but into something that was perhaps the prerequisite for both of those things. Understanding. The recognition that the answer, however insufficient, was at least honest. He gave a single, small nod. Then he turned and walked back to his brother and sister, because they needed him, and he knew it. and sat between them on the sofa with an arm around each of them. Mira watched all of this from the center of the room. When she looked back at Adrian, he was still crouched where Lucas had left him, one hand pressed flat against the worn floor, as if he needed the contact with something solid to stay upright. She had 6 years of fury. She had 6 years of exhaustion and grief, and doing it all alone, and watching her sister's children go to bed hungry, and telling herself every night that it was enough, that she was enough, even when she wasn't sure it was true. She wasn't ready to forgive him. She might never be entirely ready for that. But she looked at her nephew, Claire's boy, this man's son, sitting between his brother and sister on a battered sofa in a house that was still standing because Adrian had walked through its door tonight, and she thought about what Lucas had said at the kitchen table a week ago. That's not the same as actually doing it. She met Adrian's eyes. "They need somewhere safe tonight," she said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't welcome. It was a door, barely cracked, the width of a single night, the length of one practical sentence. But Adrian Cole, who had been knocking on closed doors his entire life, understood exactly what it was. He stood up. "I know a place," he said. And for the first time since he had watched a boy portion out dinner before feeding himself, for the first time since standing in the rain outside a cracked window, with guilt pressing against his chest like something trying to get out, Adrian did not walk away. He stayed. The safe house was an hour outside the city. Adrian drove them himself. No driver, no security detail trailing behind, just one vehicle moving through the dark on a road that thinned and quieted as Chicago fell away behind them. Rosa had fallen asleep against Mira's shoulder within 20 minutes, the particular swift unconsciousness of young children who have burned through more adrenaline than their bodies know what to do with. Tomas stayed awake longer, his face turned toward the window, watching the city lights dissolve into flat, dark countryside, with an expression that was too old for his 8 years. Lucas sat in the front passenger seat. Adrian hadn't directed him there. The boy had simply opened that door and gotten in, with the decisive quietness that characterized everything he did, and Adrian had said nothing and started the engine. They drove the first 30 minutes without speaking. The radio stayed off. The road was nearly empty at this hour, and the headlights carved a narrow corridor of visibility through the dark that felt, in its smallness, oddly appropriate for the moment. It was Lucas who spoke first. "Are those men going to come back?" "No," Adrian said. "How do you know?" "Because I made sure of it." Lucas considered this. "How?" Adrian glanced at him briefly, then back at the road. He thought about the various ways he could answer that question. The deflections, the age-appropriate simplifications, the comfortable vagueness that adults offered children when the truth was complicated. Then he thought about how Lucas had stood between his siblings and 2 grown men in a small room with nothing but his own body and the stubbornness of someone who had decided that retreat was not available to him. He decided the boy had earned something closer to honesty. "The men who sent them have been dealt with," Adrian said carefully. "They won't be a problem anymore. For you, for your family, for anyone." Lucas absorbed this with the gravity of someone who understood that "dealt with" was carrying more weight than the words themselves suggested, and who had the maturity not to push further than what was being offered. "Okay," he said. They drove on. After another few minutes, Lucas said, "Rosa cried for a long time after you put those men on the floor." "I know. I heard her. She cries when she's scared, but she never cries when she's sad. Tia says it's because she doesn't fully understand sad yet." He paused. "I think she understands more than we think." "She probably does," Adrian said. Lucas turned slightly in his seat to look at him, a direct, assessing look that Adrian was beginning to recognize as the boy's default mode of engagement. Not suspicious, exactly, more like a scientist who has decided to take careful measurements before drawing conclusions. "Do you know anything about kids?" The question was so plainly genuine that it caught Adrian off guard. He felt something that might, in different circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. "No," he said honestly. "Essentially, nothing." Lucas nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Tomas needs noise," he said, in the tone of someone delivering a practical briefing. "He gets anxious when things are too quiet. He fills the silence himself if he has to. Just let him talk. Rosa needs to know where you are in a room. She doesn't like it when people disappear without saying where they're going." Adrian looked at him. "What do you need?" Lucas turned back to the window, thought about it with genuine seriousness. "Straight answers," he said finally, "even if they're bad ones. I'd rather know a hard thing than not know it." "I can do that," Adrian said. Lucas nodded once. Conversation closed. He settled back in the seat and said nothing more for the rest of the drive. But the silence between them was different from the one they'd started with. Less like a wall, and more like a room that had been opened and aired out, still unfamiliar, but no longer sealed shut. The safe house had 4 bedrooms, a large main room, a kitchen that was functional without being warm, and enough land around it that no one could approach unannounced. Adrian had stocked it before they arrived, another call to Ortega, made from the car while the children were loading into the vehicle. By the time they walked through the door, there was food in the refrigerator, clean bedding on every bed, and a basketball in the garage that had been there for years but had never, until Tomas found it the following morning, served any purpose worth mentioning. Mira moved through the space with the systematic efficiency that was her natural mode in unfamiliar environments, checking windows, noting exits, establishing where everything was before allowing herself to be still. Adrian watched her do this without commenting on it, because he recognized the behavior. It was the same thing he did when he entered a new space, the same instinct, arrived at through entirely different circumstances, sharpened by the same fundamental need to know that the people depending on you were not going to be caught unprepared. She caught him watching once. "Security habit?" he said. "Survival habit," she corrected, without warmth but without hostility either. Then she went to check on Rosa, and Adrian went to make coffee, and they moved around each other in the kitchen with the careful, practiced neutrality of 2 people who had not yet negotiated the terms of whatever this was. Over the following days, Adrian did 2 things simultaneously. In the hours when the children were occupied, Tomas and his running basketball commentary, Rosa and her expanding refrigerator gallery, Lucas reading at the table with the focused silence of someone who had taught himself to find quiet inside noise. Adrian worked. Calls made in low voices from the far end of the property. Reeves arriving once, on the second day, for a 2-hour meeting that took place in the garage with the door closed. Decisions being made and executed with the efficiency that 20 years of practice produced. Dismantling the immediate threat with the same methodical precision he'd built everything else. But in the other hours, the meals, the evenings, the unexpected in-between moments that life in close quarters produced without warning, Adrian showed up in a different way entirely. He helped Tomas with a basketball drill on the 3rd afternoon. He was not good at it, and made no pretense of being good at it, which delighted Tomas so thoroughly that the boy spent 20 minutes coaching him with the solemn authority of an expert instructing a hopeless beginner. And the laughter that came from that coaching session carried across the property and through the kitchen window where Mira stood washing dishes. She didn't stop washing the dishes, but she listened. On the 4th evening, Rosa asked Adrian to sit with her while she finished a drawing. He sat, she drew. For 40 minutes neither of them spoke, and Rosa periodically held up her work for his inspection, with the unself-conscious confidence of an artist certain of her audience. He offered responses with the careful seriousness she clearly expected, and she accepted them with a regal nod each time before returning to her work. When Rosa finally went to bed, Mira came and stood in the doorway of the room, looking at the empty chair where Adrian had been sitting for the better part of an hour. She didn't say anything, but something in her expression had shifted, a degree of adjustment so small it would have been invisible to anyone not paying close attention. Adrian wasn't watching. He had already moved to the kitchen, but Mira stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the crayon drawings spread across the low table and thought about a man who ran a criminal empire sitting silently for 40 minutes, being the audience for a 6-year-old's art exhibition. Claire, she thought, not for the first time, you always did see things in people before they saw it themselves. Lucas sought Adrian out on the 5th evening. He found him on the back steps as the light was going, the same slow blue darkening that arrived each night over the flat, open land, wider and quieter than any sky the children had seen from their street in the city. He sat down beside Adrian without invitation or preamble, which was something new. Every previous interaction had been initiated from a standing position, with the psychological option of departure built into the stance. Sitting was different. Sitting was a choice that said, "I'm staying for this." "Reeves," Lucas said, "the man who came on Tuesday. He works for you." "Yes?" "He looked at me a lot when he was here." "He was trying to figure out who you look like," Adrian said. Lucas was quiet for a moment. "Your family or hers?" "Both, I think. Mostly hers. But certain things—" Adrian paused. "Your jaw, the way you hold your expression when you're thinking, that's not her." Lucas touched his own jaw briefly, unconsciously, the way people do when they suddenly become aware of a feature they've never thought about before. "Is that strange for you? To see that?" Adrian considered the question honestly. "Yes, but not in a bad way." He looked at the darkening field. "In a way that makes me wish I had been paying attention earlier, that I'd had more time to see it arrive." Lucas thought about this for a long moment. Around them the evening settled, insects starting up somewhere in the grass, the sky deepening through its stages, the distant sound of Tomas's basketball finally going still inside the house. "I'm not ready to trust you yet," Lucas said. "Clear and direct, as always. But I don't not trust you either. There's a space in between those things." "I know," Adrian said. "I'll stay in the space." Lucas nodded. Then, in the same even tone, as if it were simply the next practical item, "You should know that Tomas already trusts you completely. He decided on day 2. He's like that. Fast." He paused. "Don't make him regret it." The words landed with a quiet weight that Adrian felt in his chest. "I won't," he said. Lucas stood, brushed off the back of his jeans with the tidy efficiency he brought to everything, and went inside. Adrian stayed on the steps alone as the last of the light left the sky. Above him, stars began their slow appearance, faint at first, then brighter, the way they always did out here away from the city's constant interference. He thought about a space in between trust and its absence, about a boy who had described it precisely and then offered to let him inhabit it, which was, in its way, more generous than Adrian deserved, and more meaningful than anything he'd been offered in a very long time. He thought about what Mira had said in the kitchen at the mansion, about showing up not when it was convenient or when there was a crisis, but every day. Reliable, consistent, the ordinary, undramatic, repeated act of being present. He had built 20 years of power on being extraordinary in moments of crisis. What was being asked of him now was something entirely different, something quieter, something harder, something that didn't come with the clarity of a threat to eliminate or a decision to execute, something that simply required him to be there, day after day, in the spaces between the dramatic moments, in all the ordinary hours that made up an actual life. He wasn't sure he knew how. But he was beginning, slowly and with the particular humility of a man who has run out of better options, to understand that not knowing how was not the same as not being able to learn. He stayed on the steps a little longer. Then he went inside. 3 weeks after the night the back door came in, Adrian sat alone in his office and dismantled 20 years of his life. Not dramatically, not all at once. He did it the way he'd built it, methodically, quietly, one piece at a time, with the particular patience of someone who understands that large structures don't come down safely unless you respect the order in which they were assembled. He started with the outer operations, the supply chains that existed in legal gray zones, the business arrangements that only worked because of implied threat, the partnerships held together by fear rather than genuine interest. He began transferring territories, closing accounts, and making phone calls that ended with long silences on the other end, because the people receiving them had never expected to receive them and didn't have adequate language for what they were hearing. Adrian Cole was stepping back, not fleeing, not collapsing under pressure. Stepping back, deliberately and on his own terms, which was the only way he'd ever been willing to do anything. There was a difference, and he needed the people around him to understand it, because in his world, the manner of an exit mattered as much as the exit itself. Reeves took the news in the way Reeves took everything, without visible reaction, processing behind a face that gave nothing away, asking the 3 most relevant practical questions before allowing himself anything personal. The Harwick arrangement? Transferred to Dominguez. He's been ready for 2 years. The West Side agreement? Dissolved. I spoke to Carrera directly. He understands. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then, and the Ferretti situation? Adrian looked at him steadily. Handled. It had been handled 11 days ago, in the decisive and permanent way that certain problems in their world required handling. Sal Ferretti had made the mistake of treating Adrian's private life as an exploitable weakness, of sending men into a house where children slept to use them as leverage. In doing so, he had miscalculated 2 things simultaneously. The first was Adrian's capacity for swift and disproportionate response when the thing being threatened was something he actually cared about. The second was how much caring about something could clarify a man's thinking, strip away the noise, and reduce a complicated strategic situation to a single, uncomplicated decision. The decision had been made. The situation had been resolved. 2 of Ferretti's senior people had quietly relocated out of state. Ferretti himself was no longer in a position to be opportunistic about anything. Adrian didn't elaborate, and Reeves didn't ask him to. "This weakens us," Reeves said instead. Practical. Honest. The reason Adrian had kept him for 9 years. "I know. There will be people who read it as vulnerability, who try to move into the space. I know that too." Reeves studied him. "Is this about the boy?" Adrian considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because Reeves had earned that much. "It's about all 3 of them," he said finally. "And about the woman who raised them alone because I wasn't there. And about what I want to have built when I'm done. What I want it to have been worth." Reeves absorbed this, set his folder down on the edge of the desk. "You know I'm not going anywhere." "I know," Adrian said. "I'm counting on it." The safe house outside the city was a property Adrian had owned for years under a corporate name. A low, wide building on a rural lot an hour north, surrounded by enough land that no approaching vehicle could arrive unannounced. He had used it for various purposes over the years. None of them had involved cereal with cartoons on the box or crayon drawings appearing on the refrigerator by the second morning. Rosa had claimed the refrigerator as her gallery, without asking anyone's permission. Tomas had found a basketball in the garage and had spent most of the first week attempting to make shots against a hoop mounted above the door, narrating his own attempts in an enthusiastic running commentary that bounced off every wall in the building. Mira had established a routine within 48 hours, because routine was how she maintained her hold on stability. And stability was the thing she refused to let the children lose, no matter what else was shifting around them. Lucas remained the careful one. He watched Adrian the way thoughtful children watch unfamiliar things, not with hostility, but with the measured attention of someone gathering data before reaching conclusions. He asked questions that were always specific, never vague. Not, "What do you do?" but, "Why did you choose it?" Not, "Are you staying?" but, "What does staying mean for you?" Questions that cut directly to the center of things, that left no comfortable space for half-answers or polished deflections. Adrian answered every one of them honestly, which was more difficult than it sounded, because honesty about his life required admissions that were not flattering and explanations that did not resolve cleanly. He told Lucas about choices he wasn't proud of. About the point, years ago, when a different road had been available and he'd chosen the one he chose anyway because it promised power and certainty in ways the other road hadn't. About what that had cost people around him, including his mother, including Claire. He said Claire's name carefully, watching Lucas's face when he did. Lucas listened to all of it without interrupting. When Adrian finished, the boy was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the flat gray field beyond the fence line. Then he said, "Did you love her?" Adrian looked at his hands. "I didn't understand what I had until I'd already let go of it, which I think is a different thing from love, but I'm not sure it's entirely separate from it either." Lucas turned this over. "That's a complicated answer." "Yes." "But it's a true one." "Yes." Lucas nodded slowly. Outside, Tomas missed a shot and groaned loudly enough to be heard through the window, then immediately began narrating his own recovery. Rosa appeared at the back door and announced to no one in particular that she was hungry. The ordinary noise of children moving through a day, unremarkable and, to Adrian, entirely remarkable. "Okay," Lucas said. Adrian looked at him. "Okay, what?" "Okay, I'm not ready to call you anything yet," Lucas said, with a directness that was so purely Claire's that it made Adrian's chest ache in a specific, bittersweet way. "But okay, you can be here." Mira found Adrian on the back steps that evening, as the sky turned from gray to the particular deep blue that arrived just before full dark. She came and stood beside him, not sitting, arms folded, the body language of someone who hadn't yet decided how comfortable they intended to be. "He talked to you," she said. "Yes." "What did he say?" "That I can be here, that he's not ready to call me anything yet." Adrian paused. "Which is more than I deserve." Mira was quiet for a moment. The field beyond the fence had gone dark and still, and somewhere in the trees at the far end of the property a single bird was making a sound that carried clearly in the evening air. "I don't forgive you," she said. Steady. Certain. "Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. What you did to Claire? What not being there meant for her, for all of them? That's not something that gets fixed by showing up when things got dangerous." "I know." "You don't get to be the hero of this story just because you came through a door." "I'm not trying to be." She looked at him for the first time since she'd come outside. Really looked. The way she'd been carefully avoiding since the night he'd arrived, because looking required acknowledging things that were easier to keep at a distance. She saw a man who was tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Tired in the way that years of being a particular kind of person makes you tired, when the architecture you built to protect yourself starts to feel less like shelter and more like a prison you designed yourself and can't find the exit to. Claire had seen something in him once, enough to trust him, enough to love him, probably, in the quiet way Claire loved things, fully, without announcement. Mira had spent 6 years being furious at him for wasting that. She wasn't done being furious, but furious could coexist with other things, she was learning. It could coexist with the fact that Rosa had fallen asleep on the sofa inside and hadn't woken from a nightmare in 3 nights. That Tomas had laughed today, genuinely, unself-consciously, the way he used to before the fear of the sedan outside the window had tightened something in him. That Lucas had come back from a conversation with his father looking like someone who had set a weight down and was still deciding whether to pick it back up. "I want you in their lives," Mira said finally. "Consistently, not when it's convenient, not when there's a crisis. Every week, regular, reliable." She paused. "They've had enough people disappear." "Yes," he said, no hesitation. "And you're done." She said it like a condition, not a question. "Whatever this life has been, you're done with it." Adrian was quiet for a moment, Not hesitating, assembling. What I'm stepping back from can't all be undone overnight. There are pieces that require time, but the parts that put people in danger, the parts that sent men through your door, those are already gone. Mira studied him. She had a sharp eye for honesty. 6 years of managing on nothing had made her an excellent reader of people who were telling her what she wanted to hear versus people telling her what was true. She read him now, carefully, the way she'd read the boxes on her porch, and the roofer's unconvincing story, and every other thing that hadn't quite added up until it had. He was telling her the truth. She unfolded her arms, sat down on the step beside him, not close, but beside. The distinction mattered, and she knew it, and she allowed it anyway. She would have wanted this for them, Mira said softly. Not to hurt him, just because it was true, and it needed to be said. She would have wanted them to have a father, even a complicated one. Adrian didn't answer, but his jaw tightened in the particular way that meant he was holding something in that he didn't trust himself to release out loud. And Mira, who had become a student of surviving grief, recognized it and let it be. Above them, the last of the blue drained out of the sky, and the first stars appeared. Faint, then brighter, then bright, the way they always did when the city's light wasn't there to drown them out. Inside the house, a basketball bounced against a wall. Rosa laughed at something. Lucas said something in the low, steady voice he used when he was keeping order, and the noise subsided into the comfortable murmur of children settling toward the end of a day. Adrian listened to it. He had built things his entire life, built them from threat and leverage and the particular cold intelligence that fear produces when it has nowhere else to go. He had built an empire that men respected because they had no other safe option. He had built walls around himself so complete and so carefully maintained that for years he hadn't noticed they had also kept everything worth having on the outside. He had never built anything like this, something small and fragile and held together not by power, but by the tentative, unguaranteed daily act of showing up and being honest and staying. Something that could still break. Something worth protecting because it could. He looked at the stars for a long time. Then he stood, opened the back door, and went inside.